Glossolalia was a term I first heard from Terence McKenna, in which he referred to making up gibberish. And it emerged out of his work with DMT. And I realized that I'd been doing that a bit in terms of making up certain words. And I think I began doing that in Thailand, pretending they were English words and then inventing up meaning, inventing private meanings for the various words. And it was tons of fun. And more recently, I've been letting that tendency flow out, up to 10-20% of my dialogue is now essentially gibberish, or sometimes it's kind of odd assortments of English words that end up being gibberish. And it's part of it's got three legs to stand on. One is the awareness that all thought correlates with language. All language creates thought. And we're in a very tight language. I only speak English. And it's pretty linear and structured. And so the first thought is that using sound in a less controlled and more intuitive way can stimulate thought, because it suggests, if we carry the logic forward, that if all thought is contained within language, that if one is allowed to speak more intuitively and less linearly, it may facilitate the ability to think more intuitively and less linearly. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, an awareness that insights, particularly in a psychedelic nature, that one of the things that insights, knowledge, etc., that's outside the set of the current paradigm has to deal with is fitting into the box or the language of the conscious mind. And so the idea is just to widen the mesh through which insight and knowledge could come through. But the third thing, which I think is probably the most important, is I've noticed it brings joy, that while carefully and coherently structuring language to convey something precisely creates a serious note, that just making up nonsense is the exact opposite. And I also think, as a fourth leg, that breaking the rules when there's no harm, and particularly when there's pleasure in doing so, is a good discipline. It's good practice, because there's a lot of fear based on traumatic history and a desire to conform in any traumatic culture in order to not be punished, not to be re-traumatized. And that often encourages an obsessive focus on normalcy to the exclusion of ecological variety and the like. And so to break rules that stimulate thought, that don't hurt anyone, and are a practice of, I guess, a certain mental disobedience, as opposed to civil disobedience, seems like it's a good thing. And it's also tremendous fun. My wife is Filipina, and so she doesn't always know for sure whether or not what I'm saying is gibberish or English. And so it's also just fun to spew some nonsense out, and then say what that means and make it up. So it's also a creative act. And it generates an enormous amount of laughter in the house, for both of us, play, laughter, fun. which seems like it's medicinal. So this entire thing is under the umbrella of one of my biggest passions, which is that when there is a tension between normalcy and happiness can be pursued with harm to none, always pick happiness and throw normalcy to the wayside.